Welcome to the History of the Batman with Londyn, brought to you by Meltdown Comics and Collectibles in Hollywood, California. This is where we relive the defining moments of one of the most iconic figures in comic art and literature, the Batman. My name is Adam Silverstein, and I am joined with the star of the show, Londyn. Thanks for coming and being here. Also from the shadows, lurking. We don't know when he'll pop in, but we have Shadow Adam in the house. Today, this is our 8th episode. We are continuing our discussion from last week. Last week, we talked about the creators of Batman that gave prominent, that's the right word, I think, contributions to the canon. We went through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Did we get to the 70s? I think we're on the 70s,
yes,
huh?
We're at the 70s now.
Okay. So how are you, Londyn?
I'm fine. How are you?
I got so excited about all the great material we're going to talk about today. I forgot to say hello. So last week we were talking, I think you specifically said that you picked 2 creators from each decade.
Right.
And these were ones that you felt had major contributions.
Right. Each decade, I think, represented a different type of Batman, whether how he was written, how he was drawn. And I picked 2 creators, either they were both writers or artists or both, illustrating just, how Batman was in that certain time period from 1939, his debut, how he was, for his first year, he was by himself and he was just this shadowy vigilante. And I talked about the creators, Bob Kane and Bill Finger, and certain stories. And I just went through 40s and the 50s and kind of how it entered the Silver Age and certain creators. And then we ended with the 1960s with Carmine Infantino as one of the prominent artists. And now we're going to talk about the 1970s, where Batman totally transitioned from one art form and one type of theme to another.
Okay, so what you're talking when you say transition from one type of art form to another, are you talking about the TV show?
Yes, that's a really big part of it. Since from the 66, 68 live action TV show, it was very lighthearted. It was very campy. Adam West and Burt Ward, they really represented the Silver Age comics, and the villains that were in it represented how they were drawn, and it rose DC sales for Batman since they were dropping and everything, but it kind of stayed away from kind of the gothic roots that originated with Kane and Finger in the 30s and the 40s. And so the 70s definitely brought back that type of character to Batman.
So 70s kind of rode the wave of what was happening at the end of the 60s.
Right, definitely.
And just exploded with these talents and creators that are pretty much household names now.
Right. They're definitely really important to Batman's creative history.
So in the 60s, you had mentioned, I guess the earlier 60s, Batman's sales were kind of lagging, or he was stagnant or something. Why do you think that was?
I think some of the readers, they kind of got disinterested, I suppose. It was kind of happening in the mid-60s, like 63, 64, 65. And I think just the stories itself, they weren't, I don't know, it just kind of fell from, especially after they had to do the CCA, the Comics Code Authority, and kind of having to change the characters and their dynamics and how they acted. Everything was kind of gimmicky, was kind of funny, it was kind of silly, and that kind of was a turnoff for a lot of the audience that it originally had. And so I think that's why when they wanted to do the show, and William Dozier, the producer of the live-action TV show, he wanted to get a new audience in, not just the regular younger audience, but kind of an older audience too. And so the TV show really boosted that sale. And even at the end of the series, when they put in Barbara Gordon, Batgirl, and they introduced her in Detective Comics 359 in the 3rd season, that really helped the Batman, I guess, comics, rise. But once the TV show and the Batmania and all of the phenomenon that came with it, when it ended, the sales kind of took a dive again. But then in the early 70s, like 71, when the two creators that I'm going to talk about, Dennis O'Neil, Neil Adams, came, they definitely changed the way the Batman was presented and kind of took him out of that campy style.
Now, tell the listeners, who is Dennis O'Neil a creator? Is he a writer? Is he what kind of creator is he?
He is a writer. He first became prominent in Marvel, and Stan Lee kind of found him. And at first, Dennis O'Neil, he wasn't trying to write for comics. When he tried out for like a writing test, it was just because he just had time on his hands. He never considered himself he was going to write for comic books or stories, but he wrote a quick thing for Fantastic Four, and Stan Lee was interested. And then once he worked with them for a while, then he came to DC, and he worked on publications such as Wonder Woman and Justice League of America. So he did that from the late 60s to the early 70s, and then that's when he went on to Batman, and he worked alongside Neil Adams, who's an artist, and he had been doing tons of work for Marvel and DC. He worked on the characters like Deadman, and he did a lot for Green Arrow and Green Lantern, and he already had a name for himself before he even really did Batman. He did a few Superman covers and on Action Comics, and he even did World's Finest, and he'd worked on Superman and Batman as characters as a whole. But then he focused in on Batman in 1971 to like 1973.
So these two collaborated.
Yes, they were pretty much they're like the duo. Like today, when you think of Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo, you think that they're like the two Batman, dynamic duo. Adams and O'Neil were definitely that way for the early 70s. I think people who read their stories and look at how they kind of changed the face of Batman would definitely say that they had a really important part of defining Batman in that era.
Now, do you know if they came on the Batman titles together, or was one there before the other?
Well, Neil Adams definitely was there on Batman before Dennis O'Neil, but I think once he did his other projects and they wanted to kind of redefine Batman and bring in new villains and everything, I think they kind of collaborated. So for like the very end of the 60s, like 68, 69, 70, they did their own separate project with Marvel, DC, and other, comic strips. But then in 71, kind of mid-71, that's when they came together and collaborated.
And so how long did they work together?
They worked straight together for probably about...
On the Batman titles?
Yeah, on the Batman titles and Batman Detective Comics for probably about 2 years. But in that 2 years, they broke a lot of ground and they introduced a lot of characters and kind of redefined him in the moment where Batman, I think, he needed a different change. Even though I am a huge fan of the campy era in the 60s and that Silver Age style, I think that for a lot of fans that were kind of drifting away from reading Batman stories, they needed that, that grit and that gothic, style that he was originally created in, and that drew in a lot of people and a new audience.
Right. So over that 2-year period, you said they really hit a groove.
Yeah, definitely.
And came up with some amazing, I guess, stories and characters.
Right.
So why don't you tell me specifically, and then the audience in general, about what they did together? What was the magic that they ended up creating?
Well, they pretty much took the type of storyline and the adventure from the 40s and brought it into the comics now. And I think I always highlight these two even on the blog for people who really want to see, a transition from one era to another. They redefined the Joker, who was a classic character. He originated in 1940, and they brought in a new villain, Ra's al Ghul, who's now one of the most prominent and one of the most favored villains in Batman's Rogues Gallery. They first created Ra's al Ghul, and he came out in Batman 232, and that was in June of 1971. And that was the story, Daughter of the Demon. And they introduced Ra's al Ghul as the leader of the League of Assassins, which, as it sounds, they're a team of just assassins that kind of take over. And Roz is an eco-terrorist, and he has a daughter whose name is Talia al Ghul, and they pretty much create this this whole rouge against Batman to try to show him that he is the ultimate heir to take over League of Assassins when Roz is gone, and that he is the perfect mate for Talia, his daughter, and it already creates this dynamic that hadn't really been seen before. You see Roz as one of the only ones outside of the Batman family of Dick Grayson or Alfred Pennyworth that Ra's al Ghul knows the identity of Batman as Bruce Wayne. When they meet in the Batcave. I mean,
How did that happen?
Well, they don't really tell you exactly how Roz, found out all the information, but they pretty much insinuate that, he has all of the knowledge and techniques and everything to discover who, the most secretive man pretty much in the city is. And so when you first meet Roz, he's an interesting kind of like mystical character. And then when you learn about him more in the following Batman story arcs, this Ra's al Ghul kind of storyline lasts from like issues 232 to probably about 10 issues in, like 242. And at that point, Batman sees Ra's as an enemy and he has to fight him. And all in the middle of it, Talia's there and she's fallen in love with Bruce. And it's a very exciting and kind of different story that you would have seen from the 60s. It's still very, kind of mystical and magical because you first discover that Ra's al Ghul has this Lazarus pit where, if he's dying or if he's hurt or injured, he, just like, Lazarus, that legend, I mean, you go in and then he rises, from the dead, and Ra's uses that, and pretty much now I think everyone knows Lazarus pit, even if it's not in the movies, but in the comics, as a tool that Ra's uses, and it's been used on other Batman family members that you see decades later. But Neil Adams and Dennis O'Neil, they introduced a character that was mystical, yet it was kind of, in a modern sense, dark and kind of a new story that kind of brings people back to reading Bill Finger's stories a few decades before.
I mean, this was a big character. I mean, he was in the first Nolan Batman
Right,
movie,
he was in Batman Begins, and Liam Neeson played him. And even though that origin story isn't really represented in the comics, where Bruce was trained under him, because they never really had that dynamic, it's still, they kind of brought that character, which for a lot of people, I don't think, if they didn't put him in the Nolan films, I don't think people would really like him or even know him that much, because Ra's al Ghul is still prominent in 80s and 90s comics and even early 2000s, but not necessarily as this, kind of really villainous character. He's kind of out of the way. But when they put him in the films, that's when his prominence came, and now he's in, television shows like Arrow, and, he's a big character now.
So this Lazarus pit that you're talking about?
Yes.
Do they ever tell you how old Roz is?
Some just say he's thousands and thousands of years old. I mean, there's no exact number, but it's just he's pretty much been incarnated over the thousands of years, pretty much. And you learn that probably within the first arc, which is interesting, because usually with backstories and origin stories, you see the character first, and then you have to wait kind of a period of time to even know kind of who they are and what their backstory is and where they came from and everything. But kind of with this, Dennis O'Neil really puts in all of, his origin and just the type of diabolical character he is, and with League of Assassins and then with Talia, and this weird dynamic that Bruce has to deal with. He has to deal with someone who knows his identity, who knows, his training, and who kind of knows who he is, where Batman never had to deal with that before, and he kind of is, secretive on his own. And then he has the matter of a romance in a way. He's kind of turned off from Talia because she's so demanding and so, she's ordered by Roz. And that already for Talia is, a burden, because she's torn between listening to her father, who she respects, and then is torn between following how she feels about Bruce. And in the end, that just creates resentment for both of them. And so Bruce has to deal with a lot of different factors with the Al Ghul dynamic. And of course, we know that in the late 80s, the story Batman Son of the Demon, where Talia and Bruce, they get married and then they have a child, but then Bruce doesn't know, and it's this whole thing. But Damien comes from it. So in the end, Roz is a really important character because now we have Bruce's biological son, which he didn't have, I mean, he eventually adopted Dick Grayson and then later Tim Drake, and so they're technically his sons. I guess all of the Robins, you would say, he has a father-son dynamic, but he actually has a real son in Damien. So them creating Ra's al Ghul just in general was a really important for the the future decades, but bringing in this kind of story during the early 70s and really started to push Batman out of that kind of campy era for sure. And after that, just 2 years later, they reinvented the Joker. And before, even in the 40s and the early 50s, Joker was still he was killing people and, he was creating chaos and just a huge massacre. When the Comic Code Authority came in 94, he had to become a more gimmick character, really silly. He couldn't kill, really. I mean, he was just more...
Shot a gun with a flag.
Yeah, he has a flower with acid that doesn't really do anything. I mean, it's just very, it's almost comical. He's not really scary or dangerous. But then in Batman 251 from 1973, the Joker's Five-Way Revenge, that's when a lot of people, I guess a lot of comic readers and just fans in general, they know that that's when the Joker turned to kind of the crazed killer that we kind of see today, even in comics. And I discussed this on one of our earlier episodes when we talked about the 75 years of the Joker. But pretty much in the story, the Joker is released from prison, and he is trying to kill the 5 gangs that put him in prison. And he almost succeeds. He kills 3 people just out of cold blood, and Batman has to trace him all throughout Gotham to find him. And they end up kind of like at this big aquarium, and he, arrests him. But just the way that he's designed and just kind of the crazed look he has, it, took him out of that silly nature and showed that he's a really dangerous villain. And he also began to appear kind of less in comics, He didn't, not in every other Batman thing,
They saved him. They started.
Right. He's like his main arch nemesis. After that issue, he became his main villain. So they didn't want to put him in every other issue that Batman had, which was at the time monthly. They wanted to spare him out. So within a year, you may see him 3 times, if that. And they would have major stories with him. And definitely Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams, they changed Joker into the Joker that we know today, which a lot of fans really enjoy.
Wow. Those guys, did they do anything else, or were those the 2 main?
I mean, they continued. Those were the main, I think, characters that they worked on. But I mean, just in general, they did Batman stories and Batman and in Detective Comics. But I think for at least anyone interested in the, early Neil Adams work, because later, he does Batman Odyssey in the 2000s, and he does other Batman works, and so does Dennis O'Neil, especially in the 90s. But I think starting out on the character, those are 2 really important stories, and even with Ra's al Ghul, the kind of arc that people should read. I think that's really good for them to read. I think they'd be interested in that.
Wow, it's nice to see that they came in together and then continued even separately to still create the canon.
Yes, definitely.
It's like the Bat family of creators.
Exactly.
So then we move into the 80s, and I obviously have a soft spot in my heart for the 80s because that's pretty much when I was fully into comics.
Okay.
I just got done with the Daredevil Frank Miller, and so I assume that you'll be talking about Frank Miller in the 80s.
Yes, definitely.
So who are your creators in the 80s that you
80s?
Are, feeling as the big contributors?
I picked Frank Miller, and I picked Jim Starlin. But definitely Frank Miller, I think, should go first and foremost for the 80s.
Should we save him? Should you start about Jim Starlin first?
I could talk about Jim Starlin first.
Okay, because I wanted to end with Frank Miller. I'm wearing my Daredevil shirt. I know I shouldn't say
that.
this in a Batman podcast, but...
No, that's totally fine.
But I did it in special honor of today. So anyway, sorry. Jim Starlin. Tell me a little bit about Jim.
Jim Starlin, he pretty much emerged in the late 80s, which is interesting because the early 80s, it's still kind of spanned off of like Steve Englehart and creators like that. And they, kind of kept the same momentum that Neil Adams and Dennis O'Neil were having with Batman in terms of like transitioning him to kind of darker stories, darker characters, kind of more, serious, I guess, toned stories. And then Jim Starlin, he kind of came and he started on Batman and Detective Comics kind of in the late 80s. And I picked him because he wrote one of probably the most important Batman stories within the 80s, and actually one of them within Batman's history altogether, and that was in
By the way, they're moving a lot of stuff here at Meltdown Comics.
Always
busy. So maybe I should give a shout out to our sponsor, Meltdown Comics, because they're reminding us that we are there. So 7522 Sunset Boulevard, come on down and check out meltcomics.com for a list of great things, calendar and all kinds of other great stuff. So they're saying hi to the audience right now by moving a lot of stuff. We're getting ready for a Dan Klaus signing, so it's going to be huge.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
No, that's fine. But yeah, Jim Starlin, he wrote one of the most important stories, I think, in Batman's mythos, and that was in 1988, 1989's Batman: A Death in the Family. And that had a lot of different artists on it, like Jim Aparo. But pretty much that story is significant because it killed off the second Robin at the time, who was Jason Todd. And he was introduced in 1983, became Robin in 1984. And it was in response to actually the audience who didn't like Jason Todd as a character. And this was the first time DC kind of dealt with it in terms of having the fans technically decide whether or not they want to continue having this character in Batman's mythos. So they gave out a 1-900 number that people could call in, and they can vote whether they wanted Jason Todd in the story to live or to die, and it would be by the hands of the Joker. And by a really small margin, it pretty much turned out that people voted for Jason Todd to be killed. And so in the third issue, you discover that Joker beat Jason Todd with a crowbar and then left him in a warehouse, and it exploded, and Batman finds his body. And that's it's not just horrific because someone dies in Batman's family, but you see the ripples of that event happening even in later Batman stories and Detective Comics stories that Jim Starlin writes. It kind of shows Batman feeling guilty, him feeling, sad and lonely, without a Robin. So for a period of time, he probably for about 2 or 3 years, he really didn't have that kind of sidekick that he now had since pretty much the 40s. So I see Jim Starlin as important, and he's also important in the 90s as well. He, contributes to stories like Nightfall. But I think this story in the late 80s and his prominence for Batman was really important because this story was, along the lines of Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, right at the same time. They both presented not just Joker, just so happens that Joker's the villain in both, but just really dark tales that kind of definitely showed Batman in a new, kind of the modern Batman that we now see today. That's why I think a lot of people, when they read comics from like the early to late 2000s and, even New 52, they only really know this kind of dark Batman. So when people a lot of times see anything else, anything more lighthearted or kind of quote unquote silly, it's because, it's been rooted since Jim Starlin and even Frank Miller in the mid 80s that Batman is, a dark knight. Like he puts the dark in Dark Knight at this point. And it's harder for people, maybe they don't want to read like Batman 66, like the comic, like the Mike Allred that's doing right now, which I enjoy because I like the 60s Batman. But it's like that versus reading, Endgame and, Zero Year and all of those stories. They're very different, but it's, I guess Jim Starlin and Frank Miller, they kind of introduced the modern Batman that we know today. And so I picked those two. And then, yes, Frank Miller, he would be our next one for sure.
Just an interesting comment on Jim Starlin. I mean, I think that this guy is, just an amazing creator.
Oh,
when,
definitely.
When you really think about it. I mean, some of his big contributions for Marvel were Captain Marvel,
Yes.
Dread Star, Infinity Gauntlet, like these huge space
Right.
odysseys. We're
Exactly.
talking, universe-spanning stories.
Right.
And then he could write the street-level Batman, one of the most iconic stories, killing Robin.
Right.
It just shows, a little bit of diversity in what this guy's able to do.
He's an amazing creator and has contributed to all kinds of stories. And that's why I really wanted to make sure I included him in this retrospect, because even if, this is just like one story, but it's a huge story, like you said. It's
and
iconic.
he used a 900 number.
Right, which they never did that before.
I mean, people, you could even say today, younger people, use a 900. They're like, what?
They're like, what's that?
What's a 900 number? But that people used to get charged a ton. They'd be calling.
Right.
Remember the late night commercials? Call 1-900 beach party or something.
Wasn't there a lot of controversy behind the 1-900 number because it was automated?
Yeah, and years after, people came out and said that, there were votes added, and there was this one person who, kept voting continuously, and so people think that, oh, maybe, it wasn't true to what it was supposed to be. Maybe he should have lived. But then when you hear creators talk about it, they said, okay, well, let's say Jason Todd, they decided to let him live. They weren't going to let him be Robin anymore.
And you know what else you probably saw around that time, which is something you still see today? You see the ugly side of fans, really.
Right.
They just will rip things. Not everyone can be happy, right? So you've got a top creator doing something to engage the audience, and not everyone's going to be happy.
Right.
And so even if you're at the top of the game, you're going to have haters. And clearly it was in the 70s, and it is to today. I mean, you just can't make everyone happy, and it's really unfortunate. That's one of the things I appreciate about you is you have a very good attitude about how things play out. You're keep an open mind. Why hate when you can just enjoy? I mean, the way I look at comic books, one of the things as I have grown, like, for example, my favorite comic book is Daredevil. All right. I've told you this. And Daredevil's stories have not always been good. Mm-hmm. Right? There was a time when he switched to a black armored uniform. It was just a terrible story. I did not enjoy it.
Yeah.
But I stayed with the character because in life you have ups and downs. You don't always have the most exciting thing happen, and it's not always good. And that's the same thing with comics. So for so long, I didn't even know about creators because I was so into the character.
Right.
And the point being is I'm open-minded, I believe, about these characters, and I think you are too with Batman.
Definitely. I mean, I think a lot of people, they have their particular favorite type of Batman, but the fact that you can have a favorite type, that he's so diverse and it's not the same character for 70 plus years, I think speaks to the creators and that they should kind of, be noticed, because if your favorite type of Batman came from the 80s, I mean, he was different from the Batman in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s. So I think it's important for fans, to have an open mind. I mean, I know a lot of people going into when they started the New 52, a lot of people didn't like it because it was so kind of pigeonholed and it didn't really expand, it didn't have as much of, kind of like the multiverse that it could have, which is why I was really interested in how Convergence kind of ended this week and how now we have all kinds of, it turned from the universe to the multiverse. And even though, everyone was kind of surprised with the ending. I liked it because now you can pick from all different types now, I think, if you think about it, of different Batman. So, yeah, having an open mind with comics is really important because your favorite Batman will probably come from a certain creator, and that creator isn't going to draw or write Batman forever. So you kind of have to have an open mind with, especially if you really like a character, like you really like Daredevil. You have to be open to all the different types of creators for it.
And I just think that's an important point that that you stress. Just keep an open mind.
Definitely.
All right? And stop hating so much on these things and just let the stories play out.
Yeah.
And if you don't like it, go back and find something that you will like.
I mean, I say that to the people who follow the page all the time, especially with all of the movie news and, everything, and everyone's so opinionated, and already people are so just have hate for it. They're like, oh, I'm not going to like it. I'm going to boycott it. I don't like this. It's like you have to be open to it because we don't know everything about it yet. And in the end, which has happened a lot, especially, when Heath Ledger was playing the Joker, there was so much hate towards him. They're like, no, this looks different. I don't like this. This isn't going to be like, when I saw Jack Nicholson do it, I don't like him. And, it just is so much.
Right.
There's so many opinions, and it's so negative.
Right. It sounds like a crotchety old grandpa who just can't change in his ways. You know what I mean?
You definitely have to be open, especially with a field that is built on creativity. I mean, comics, it's imagination at its best. So you can't be so, confined to one thing. You really should have an open mind. I definitely agree.
Cool. Well, I'm glad we agree on that. Talk about Frank Miller, because I believe personally that he was the one that changed Batman into what he solidified it as to what people know today. And I may be wrong.
No.
But that's what I think. So tell me.
Definitely. I mean, Frank Miller, he started, he's a writer and an artist, but he started, not even in Marvel or DC. He kind of did works for like Twilight Zone, and then once he did go to Marvel, he worked on the Spectacular Spider-Man, and then for you, he worked on Daredevil, which was in the late 70s, and then he went to the early 80s, and he kind of worked on that character in that book for a while. He
sharpened his sword and then just crushed it.
Exactly. And he
Batman.
introduced Elektra, and then he started on Wolverine, and he was a really huge force within the Marvel universe. And then he went in to do DC, and they asked him to work on Batman, and I think that's when everything kind of changed. And I know a lot of people that they either really love Frank Miller and they love his work, or they don't like him at all, or they just like him for his mid-'80s Batman, and that's it. I mean, I've met people who are like, that's all I like him for, even though Frank Miller's done tons of work, but he really redefined Batman in 1986, Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, 4-issue arc. It was him and Klaus Janson and Lynn Varley, and it pretty much put Batman in a kind of alternate time span. It's in the future. Batman's a 55-year-old retired Batman. I mean, he retired for 10 years, and it was due to, in this comic, in this universe, the death of Jason Todd, which everyone kind of thinks is a coincidence because later he dies in the regular continuity, but I think it's just coincidence. But
that's your opinion.
That is my opinion. I mean, I did not create them, and I don't know what the creators did. Maybe they liked that and thought, hey, let's do it. I don't know. But yeah, he did The Dark Knight Returns, and it pretty much says what the title is. He comes out of retirement when this new criminal group, the mutant gang, come and they're taking over Gotham, and he feels like he needs to go back and put on the cape and the cowl and defend his city, even though he's at an older age and he hasn't been Batman, hasn't been fighting or anything, training, none of that for a long period of time. And you kind of see him as, you see him, he's like bulkier and bigger, and he is older, and he's a little bit more grittier and meaner, and yet he's so determined to come back as the same Batman that he was. And in the beginning of the arc, it's interesting to look at him because he feels like he can be the exact same Batman he was 10 years ago. But then once he starts fighting and then he pretty much gets beaten, you see him kind of come back and kind of look at himself and say, I am Batman, I'm not the same Batman, but I can still defend the city. And then, of course, Superman comes in, and they have that dynamic, and Superman has to pretty much fight Batman, kind of due to U.S. orders, and then that's why you have the ultimate Batman versus Superman fight that everyone quotes and loves, and is now what people think is what is a reflection on the movie that's going to come out next year, the Batman versus Superman.
And didn't Frank Miller do that scene or have that fight because he just didn't like Superman?
That's what people say. And I mean, I think I've read recent interviews with Frank Miller, and he said that he has no problem with Superman. So I think people want to think that he just hates Superman, and so he wanted Batman to beat him because, he's the most powerful being pretty much in that universe. And so this ordinary man can beat such an extraordinary, person. He has to be the best. And that is a fine, thought to have. And, especially if you love Batman, like Batman's my favorite. But then again, in the story, he has so much help and so much aid. And in the end, that Superman is holding back and he doesn't want to fight him.
And then there's armor, right?
Right. He has this super high-tech armor. Then he has Oliver Queen or Green Arrow come, and he has, kryptonite arrows, and it's just, he has a lot of help and aid. It's not just them, dumped on the street saying fight to the death with nothing, no prep time or anything. I mean, he prepped for, and I think he knew that because he is older. He's not the same Batman. He prepped for what he needed to do, and that was to stop Superman. And it turned out, as in all, a great story visually. It was a great story written, and it presented a Batman that, like I said, that we now kind of see in the 90s and the 2000s, what we see today.
In your opinion, why do you think that story had such an impact?
I think it was because, of the format, the kind of the prestige, square panel format, just the way that it looked, the kind of paper that it was. It wasn't like the same type of, it's kind of a more grit. Yeah, it's, but it's kind of like not just like the newspaper print. It was kind of more gritty. It's just everything about it was different. It was a very night and day towards even the late 70s and what that was presenting. And it definitely made people take Batman away from what he was like in the 60s. And even though it's 2 decades away, the 60s, it was such an impact. The live action made Batman in the 60s the Batman that everyone knew. So kind of taking something that was universal to everybody. People who don't even read comics, they knew Batman because of the television series. This comic, it introduced people, an older audience, I guess. They were trying to create an audience or comics for an adult audience, not just boys in the ranges of 12 to 15. It was like they wanted to reach out to older, comic book readers, and this story, it was a little more violent, it was a little more gritty, and that really hooked them in.
It sounds like it was an event.
Right. It was something that was really, and even if you think about it now, it's really groundbreaking because it really set a different tone. It, created a new mold for Batman, and Frank Miller continued that with redoing his Batman's origin story, and he did that in 1987's Batman Year One, and the artist was David Mazzucchelli, and that was a 4-issue arc, and everyone knows Batman's origin. His mother and father were gunned down by a mugger in an alley after coming home from the theater, and then, Bruce trained and swore vengeance on his parents by becoming this shadowy figure, and he became the Batman. Well, Frank Miller, he reintroduced this story and to a new generation, this new audience that's coming into Batman, and he also gave us a look at that interesting period between when Bruce's parents died to when he's actually Batman.
Right.
And you don't really see that. And so you kind of see how he trains abroad, and you see the first, it's his first year. It's literally the first times, the first instances where he dresses up as Batman, and he gets hurt and he stumbles and he's, kind of sloppy. I mean, but it's his first time being Batman, and you don't really get to see that in a lot of comics. He's just, boom, he's already Batman. He's been in the game for years, and he's the world's greatest detective. But in here, you see him struggling to become what he ultimately becomes.
Right,
so.
Which is interesting because he also, Frank Miller, did that for Daredevil with A Man Without Fear.
Right, exactly.
And which was a prestige format comic.
Yeah,
real quick,
definitely.
about The Dark Knight Returns,
yes.
or the, that one. So, was that, because it was in the future, right?
Right.
Had they done a lot of that where they take Batman out of the continuity before that?
No, because the idea of an Elseworld, which is pretty much all of the alternate continuities and stories that we know now, that didn't happen until Gotham by Gaslight, which was in 1989, and that was a Mike Mignola, a P. Craig story. But yeah, this was different because it was kind of, in a way, I mean, an unofficial Elseworld. It was kind of in the future, and it didn't match at all to the continuity that Batman was in before. It wasn't stated that it was an Elseworld. It just showed a kind of what if type of story, like, what if in the future this is what Batman is? It didn't fall in line. And that's what I think is interesting, because everyone wants to say that, oh, Batman beats Superman in the continuity. But if you really think about it, it's not really in the continuity that it was then. You can technically say it's an out-of-universe story. And if you wanted to, you could say it doesn't really count into the comics that were, in the regular timeline for Batman and all the DC universe. So that in itself was different.
Wow. So another contributing factor of why the perfect storm for this Frank Miller run.
Definitely.
All right, real quick, we just have to give a shout out to our sponsor, Comics Fix, a digital comic platform. It's a subscription-based service where you pay and a per month fee, and then you get to read as many comics that are on the site, kind of like Netflix. They just recently got all 72 issues of The Boys by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson. They're available. So check out Comics Fix. You can read it on your computer, on your tablet, on your phone. So check out Comics Fix, comicsfix.com. All right. Frank Miller, we just got done talking about. Are we done with the 80s? Can we move into the 90s?
Sure, we can move into the 90s, even though I think it's interesting to note that recently Frank Miller is going to do the last chapter of Dark Knight Returns. It's Dark Knight Returns 3, and I'm kind of interested to see how he's going to continue that story.
Right. Now, also then, so Frank Miller did a follow-up. He did a sequel.
He did The Dark Knight Strikes Again, which is in the early 2000s, and in my opinion, that wasn't his best contribution to this story.
That was other people had that opinion as well.
Right. I'm not saying it was horrible, but I'm saying it wasn't the best that it could have been, of course.
And then there was the time he did the Batman with All-Star Batman with Jim Lee.
Yes, that is my guilty pleasure.
Really?
Yes, I love All-Star Batman.
So he satisfied your tastes at that point.
I mean, I almost see that Batman as almost like a satire on Batman. I mean, it's so kind of overly like what Batman really would be if he was just a hard ass all the time and just an ass to everybody. I mean, I love that. That's totally my favorite. I'm so sad it kind of was sprinkled over a period of time.
It never came out on time.
It never really, it didn't come out on time and didn't really finish technically. It kind of just left with issue 10, and I'm like, well, what happened?
It's like a B movie. It's so bad, it's good.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love it. I love the goddamn Batman. That's like my favorite.
Now he's coming back, right?
Yes.
When is this?
They said it's going to be later this year. It said in the fall. And I think Brian Azzarello is going to be a contributing artist. They didn't say anyone else yet. But I'm just interested to see how they're going to move forward with it. So, there's more Frank Miller to enjoy soon, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that too.
Yes, I will. Well, I've kind of fallen off the Frank Miller bandwagon. I mean, I love what he's done. I love his stuff. I love 300.
Right.
I love Sin City.
Okay.
But I was less impressed with the second Dark Knight. I was not I don't have as guilty of a pleasure from All Star Batman, and so I just have. I'm reserved in my judgment. I'll be.
That's fine.
Yes, I will. I will buy it. I will support, but I will want to wait and to make an opinion because I know he's capable of absolute brilliance.
Right.
I mean, clearly his influence on comics culture is humongous.
Definitely.
I don't think it, and I think he's just a genius for what he's done, and so I'm open to whatever he will do.
Right, and I agree completely with that, but I also think, and this is my opinion, I'm sure people would disagree, is that when he did The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One, that was like his peak. That was like his ultimate, I don't think he can do any better than that. I think he can do great work. Right. I think that the third one could be fantastic, but I don't think it would measure up to what everyone I think thinks is going to happen. They think he's going to make another Dark Knight Returns. Yeah. And I think that's a really high expectation.
I mean, you know what? It's common with a lot of musical artists, especially hip hop artists. I mean, Nas, everyone's like his best stuff, his first album, and he'll never get there again. So, I mean, I'm not saying that Frank Miller's first stuff, but he reached that pinnacle, and people are never going to be satisfied.
And I think that's why people they have to, see like, okay, well, Frank Miller, he did this amazing thing, this amazing contribution to Batman in the mid 80s, but we'll see what he comes out with in the fall. I'll read it definitely.
Okay. So, moving on to the 90s.
Yep, moving on to the 90s.
You're going to talk a little bit about Chuck Dixon.
Yes.
And Norm Breyfogle?
Yes, Norm Breyfogle. Those two, they definitely they both contributed very interestingly to Batman, I think. Coming into the 90s, you had, especially in the early 90s, you had movies like Batman Returns, Tim Burton's sequel to Batman, and that was already in itself kind of like a dark kind of film, so dark that they kind of moved away from it from the rest of the films. And so you already were kind of in this kind of dark Batman kind of gritty period, and then Chuck Dixon comes, who I think is an extraordinary writer, and he already worked on characters like the Punisher, and he even he was really important to Batman, first off because he created the third Robin that would come after Jason Todd, Tim Drake, and he even gave him his own publication, and he was the first Robin to kind of have his own self-titled publication. And I guess if you had to pick stories that Chuck Dixon gave to Batman, it would definitely be his early run in the 90s with Batman Nightfall, which of course was a crossover, huge epic. And
Mason's favorite Bane.
No, yes, his favorite villain, Bane. Awesome.
Mason, our wonderful engineer and producer.
And he contributed to Nightfall and Detective Comics 644 to 738. I mean, it was a huge, contribution. And yes, he helped create the character Bane, who we know is the man who broke the bat in Batman 497. And that's the climax of the first story, Nightfall. And then you have Knight's Quest and Knight's End. And he contributed to that storyline that kind of altered the Batman family for a period of time, introduced characters like John Paul Valley, and then you kind of saw Batman and Dick Grayson's relationship grow in Prodigal, and even the early 90s was a really big period for Chuck Dixon, but I think he also contributed to Batman No Man's Land, which I think is a really great story. That was a year-long epic. It was in 1999, and the artist was Graham Nolan, who was also a really great contributor in the 90s. It's interesting because the 90s, I think, is probably the decade that people, I think, maybe for some people it was like their Batman. It was the Batman they grew up on. It was the first Batman that I read. So the 90s for me was an important era because that's when I started to get into comics and really liked them and kind of expanded upon it. But unless you kind of grew up in it and was right there, the 90s kind of can pass you by too. I think it's one of those eras that isn't the main top 5 eras in Batman or was the main Batman, even though huge story arcs like Nightfall and No Man's Land, these huge epics, these huge stories where, especially in No Man's Land after the huge earthquake in Gotham, and then Gotham is pretty much deserted by the U.S. And then,
I thought that was a great story.
yeah, I think it's a fantastic storyline. I mean, because you get to see different characters, you get to explore Commissioner Gordon and his struggles and his family, and you get to see people that live in Gotham and see how they're suffering and how Batman and the Batman family kind of have to go underground to try to save the city. And it's really interesting. It's a really good story if you want to know more about Gotham City itself, which I think can also be a future episode. I could totally just go on the history of Gotham City in real life and in the comics, because it's in itself, it's a really interesting concept. It's not just Batman City. It's just like it's a whole entity of its own.
I got a quick question, quick
Sure.
aside. So DC's obviously known for using fake cities.
Right.
Gotham is supposed to be New York.
Yeah, I mean, the first time you kind of, because Gotham City, when Batman first started, it didn't exist. It took about a year for it to even be called Gotham City, and it was just known as a metropolis or a New York-style city. But a lot of times, especially in future stories, a lot of artists take, inspiration from Chicago and Los Angeles. I mean, it can be almost just any huge metropolis at this point.
Okay.
But yeah, when it started, definitely New York.
And then what was Metropolis modeled after? New York also? The brighter side of it?
Yeah, pretty much the brighter side of it. I mean, it pretty much, and even Frank Miller, he stated once that, Metropolis is New York by day and Gotham City is New York by night.
There
so,
you go.
I mean, that's as simple as it probably could be.
And that's a great answer, and that answers my question, so thank you. All right, so No Man's Land, I did think that actually brought me back into the Batman fold.
Yeah, and even though it was like right before the 2000s, but it was an epic story. I mean, it lasted a year, it was a crossover, and it also introduced the character Harley Quinn into Batman canon. In her own one-shot Batman Harley Quinn. It has the, I guess now iconic Alex Ross cover with her and Joker. And I mean, it was a really important story for Batman, I think. So definitely Chuck Dixon did a lot of contribution to Batman in the 90s and kind of molded new characters, new storylines, and new kind of history to Batman that's really important even today.
Wow.
So yeah, Chuck Dixon is my first, and then Norm Brayfogle, who is an amazing artist. He worked on a lot of Batman stories, and one of my favorites, and I'd always recommend publications for Batman fans. It's not just Batman and Detective Comics that Batman's in. I mean, he's had different publications like Legends of the Dark Knight, and then the publication that Norm Brayfogle was for is The Shadow of the Bat, and that was from 1992 to 1993. It lasted, only a certain amount of issues, but it, introduced stories that, introduced, Arkham Asylum. It kind of reinvented that, because Arkham was introduced in 1974, but it wasn't really a huge, I guess, known staple as probably Arkham is now, especially since it's been highlighted by the Rocksteady video games and everything like that. But I think Shadow of the Bat, the first issues 1 through 4, it introduced Jeremiah Arkham, who was the creator of Arkham Asylum and rebuilt it, and then the villain Zaz. And now those two figures are really important characters. And I think that kind of publication as a whole, it kind of introduces new, stories that we've never seen in Batman and new characters, and kind of gives it a different, type of look to Batman. And it really stayed well within the early 90s, after Nightfall came, and then, of course, Batman the Animated Series came, which is a film kind of noir type of look. And I think that kind of look was definitely part of the early 90s. And I think this publication was definitely a good one to see with that.
Right.
Yeah.
How many comics have you read? Batman comics?
Oh, I don't know.
I mean, I cannot get over how much you know. I mean, it's awesome.
A lot. I don't think I could put a number to it.
But these are stories that you've read.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I can't really talk about stories to such a great extent if I personally haven't looked at the stories themselves. Like, I can give a general about what it's about, but like me knowing whether or not, oh, this is a really good story for Batman fans, or this is like, oh, it's an okay story, it's a Batman story, but it's not so significant. It's really important, and that's what I tell everyone that follows the blog. I'm like, I'm giving a general, synopsis or basically what it's about, but you reading it is going to be way more spectacular than anything that I could ever say.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, when I talk about certain comics, especially on here, I'm pretty much telling people, read these comics. I mean, they're definitely great stories that I think you should actually go out and read and, really, immerse yourself into more Batman, because there's so many different types of ways that Batman's been drawn and written and just shown that you can never read all Batman, which I think is awesome. There's never like, oh, I've read all of the Batman stories that there ever was. I don't think that'll ever happen, especially since more are being produced. But that's a good thing. That means you can just keep, knowing more stories and loving the character more and discovering new characters.
Right. And listening to this podcast, finding some artists that are noteworthy,
right,
or series that are noteworthy,
right,
storylines.
Definitely. And then you'll probably find someone, if you're reading a certain, time period or certain publication, like if you're reading Shadow of the Bat, I mean, you'll fall in love with Norm Breyfogel's work. I mean, that's what I did. I mean, I really love his work. He contributed to Batman Nightfall and also No Man's Land as well. But then I also recommend the next story that I wanted to at least mention was he did an Elseworlds. And Elseworlds were only a few years old, I guess, in DC Universe just in general. And it started, like I mentioned earlier, I think with Batman Gotham by Gaslight, which was depicting a Victorian-era Batman, and he has to go after Gotham's Jack the Ripper, pretty much. And I think that's fascinating. That's pretty much one of my favorite stories. And Norm Breyfogle brings an Elseworld in Batman Holy Terror, and it shows a new side to Batman kind of finding vengeance to his parents' killers, because he discovers that, first of all, he is a clergyman, so he's part of the cloth, so that's already kind of interesting. And he discovers that his parents' death was kind of planned. It was part of this whole system, and he's trying to discover who did it and why they would, kill his parents. It wasn't a random act of violence. It had a purpose to it. And so once he's trying to investigate who killed his parents, he dresses up in an old costume that his father had, and it was just a huge bat. And so, it kind of had that same, Batman style. But it's just a new way to show audiences, that even though it's a completely different story, he's in a different, he's doing something different. He lives in a certain period. And that's why I like Elseworlds, because you see Batman in so many different ways, but you always come back to the same story. You always come back to him, bringing, vengeance from something that horribly happened to him, and he ends up wearing the Batman costume. And Norm Breyfogle with this definitely did that with Batman Holy Terror. And it's a one-shot, and I definitely recommend it. It's a really good story.
So Elseworlds, for the uninformed, are just alternate universes,
right,
out of continuity Batman stories?
It's actually for all of the DC universe. If you can read a Superman one or Wonder Woman or Justice League. But yeah, that Elseworlds publications are pretty much DC Comics under, it can be any universe. It can be anything you can think of. And Batman has had tons of different Elseworlds, and it's lots of different periods and different styles. And I think, like we were talking about earlier, keeping an open mind, Elseworlds definitely showed how creators can use their imagination. I mean, they can put Batman in any type of setting, whether past, present, or future, anywhere in the world, and still tell the same story. Batman can either be in the Victorian era, or he can be a cowboy, like in Batman, the Blue, the Gray, and the Bat.
Or a pirate?
Yeah. You've seen him in the Pirate, too. I mean, just everything. Pretty much almost anything you could think of Batman been doing, he's probably been presented in Elseworlds, or probably Grant Morrison got a hold of him and did something. I mean, you can place Batman anywhere, and he's still Batman, which is interesting, And definitely Norm Breyfogle did that with Batman and Shadow of the Bat and Batman Holy Terror. And those are my two for the 1990s, Chuck Dixon and Norm Breyfogle.
Wow.
So, as a quick aside, as someone who knows you, how hard was it not to include Kelly Jones in the 1990s?
Oh, it was so hard because Kelly Jones is my favorite.
Okay, well, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. There is no way we're getting to pre-New 52 and New 52 this episode. We're just not going to do it.
Not going to do it?
And I
Okay.
think we can actually, I know Mason is smiling somewhere because he told us we would never fit all these creators in. So why don't you take this last little bit of time to talk about your favorite.
Oh, that's so nice.
That way, no one is going home unhappy
my
here.
goodness. Okay.
And I want to know why. I mean, your favorite. This is breaking podcast news. I mean, a favorite from someone who knows so much. There better be some reasons that I can't wait to hear. And
Okay. Well, first of all, I am a huge horror genre fan. I'm huge scary movies, all of that. And Kelly Jones, and since we're talking about Elseworlds, Kelly Jones, he and Doug Moench, they did the Vampire Batman. You know, they did Red Rain and Crimson Mist and Bloodstorm, and pretty much depicted Batman as being bitten by pretty much Dracula, and he's a vampire. And Kelly Jones's work is just, I mean, it is just dripping with just horror, and you just feel all of the Dracula, all of the werewolf, all of everything that you would love seeing any of the films. I mean,
the over-exaggerated long ears.
I mean, the long ears. The long cowl is my favorite. Everyone hates long ears on Batman. I love it. It's like to the ceiling. If it's on a cover, it protrudes over the title. And I mean, it's just so, I guess, dark and creepy. And that's what I love. I love any type of that. I love those genres. I mean, that, and especially when it's even on Nightfall, when he did covers for Nightfall. And that has nothing to do, no vampire, nothing scary with Nightfall, but that's just how he draws his Batman. The cape is just draped everywhere, and it's just so dramatic and so angular, all of his lines. And I was so happy when I was reading Convergence and reading the Batman crossovers for it. They did Convergence #2 for Swamp Thing was with Red Rain Batman, and it was a vampire Batman, and him and Swamp Thing had to go to his Gotham City in his universe and had to kill all of the vampires. And you just see that just exaggerated, just ghoulish, horrific kind of story art. And yes, Kelly Jones, I love it. It's so exaggerated, and definitely, and I love tons of different artists and writers for different reasons, but I just always loved seeing that from Kelly Jones. I loved Gotham at Midnight. I loved all of his stories, and no matter what it is, it's so like, you know, you're watching a horror movie, and I think it's just awesome. But yes, Kelly Jones is my favorite, and it was really hard for me to put that in there, but I'm like, no, that's not fair, because, you know, he contributed to tons of stories, but that's just me being totally biased. So I didn't put him in. But
you're allowed to give your favorites. I mean, I think
but I want to be fair.
No, you are fair and objective, and you have your favorites too, and that's okay. I mean, that's what makes this great, because we want to know what the things that really, you know, that you're absorbing and that you love. I mean, you know, that's why people are tuning in, because not only are you giving a little bit of history and context, but you're sharing your favorites, and maybe someone is going to see you somewhere and say, that Kelly Jones, that was the one.
If ever Kelly Jones ever comes across this episode, I'm almost embarrassed because I'm like fangirling and super excited over his work, but I really do love his work. Definitely, yeah, my favorite artist, I would have to say.
Nice.
And so thank you for letting me gush over.
Oh, thank you for gushing. Thank you for gushing. So, I think we'll probably wrap up this episode, and we'll just continue on the next episode with the pre-52 creators, the new 52 creators, and then if we have time, we'll get into something very special that you have planned for even after that. So why don't you tell everyone what you are planning for them?
Well, for these creators?
No, because we know that they're...
You already know.
We know they're going to be creators.
Next.
I want the next juice.
Oh, yeah, the next episode. after we kind of get through all the careers, I think is a really interesting one, and it's Batman's love interest.
Ooh.
I mean, Batman, we all love that he's human, but I mean, he has human emotions and feelings, and he does have a heart. And I think a lot of people, they're interested to see, if Batman would ever settle down or if he would ever choose someone over kind of his love for justice. And so we're going to go over certain characters that have taken his heart over the past 76 years.
Oh, that's so sweet. I wish we could release that for Valentine's Day.
I know. I'll think of something.
Okay. All right. So also, do you want to give a shout out to the Digital Lizards of Doom?
Yes, I actually, some of the stories that we're going to talk about in the next episode, and one that I covered, Batman Year One, I just was a guest on their show, and they are so rad, and I got to talk about 2 essential Batman comics that I think every Batman fan should love and read, and yeah, definitely check me out on that show. It was very fun.
And Digital Lizards of Doom are a band that are based in San Diego.
Right.
They do a YouTube show for Meltdown and talk comics, have great creators on there.
Yeah.
And you were there.
Right. They have great guests, and their show is just tons of fun to listen to and to watch. I definitely recommend anyone watching Digital Lizards of Doom for sure.
Nice. All right. So, Bat fans, Gothamites. How can everyone get in touch with you?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, if you aren't already, you can definitely follow at Instagram.com/historyofthebatman. But if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything you want me to answer for you or reference or anything, just email me at historyofthebatman@gmail.com, and I will definitely get back to you. I'm open to any comments or any references, anything you guys want to know. If you think that some of the creators that I'm talking about, aren't the best in the decades and you have your own, and I definitely want to hear from you. So yes, email me at historyofthebatman@gmail.com.
Sounds good. And are there any other, didn't you just start a Twitter page?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I'm just starting on there. I feel like the last one to start on Twitter, but I'm at twitter.com/hist, HIST of the Batman. So give a follow, please.
There you go. And we are here at Meltdown Comics. You can find us at meltcomics.com. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook. I don't even know if anyone uses Facebook anymore. I heard that it's dying, but I don't know. Anyway, Shadow Adam, thank you, as always, for being here. It's always fun. And just like to shout out our producer and engineer, Mason Booker. I am Adam Silverstein, the co-producer and fellow Batman fan now. I'm for sure all in. So thank you for converting me again and bringing me to the light from the darkness. This is, as always, the History of the Batman with Londyn. Brought to you by Meltdown Comics. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week. Peace and love.